I came to NPR 25, almost 26 years ago now from Science Magazine, where I was a staff writer. I'm going to give you my background because I think it'll give you some perspective on where I'm coming from in all this and talk to you a little bit about my approach to writing. But I had been working, so from 1986 until 1992, the end of 1992, so almost 7 years, I had worked about 7 years, split almost equally between Nature, the British science publication, and Science, the American science publication. And I wrote a lot. I mean, I wrote a lot of articles. Whenever I got a little depressed later on and I was feeling bad about myself, I'd go to the Science Citation Index and look up the number of articles I had in Nature. They're all listed. So I have hundreds, which is, nice to put on your resume, but it doesn't really count. Anyway, so I went to work at NPR, and it suited me, and I'll tell you why I changed jobs in a few minutes. But some people came up to me afterwards, and they, when they'd heard me for a while, and they said, "How does it feel to not be writing anymore?" And I thought to myself, are you crazy? Do you not know how this works? Do you think this is all off the cuff? Am I making this up? And then I realized it was a compliment, because the whole point of writing for broadcast is not to sound like you're reading a script, but to sound like you're just talking to the audience. And so I feel good about that. My entire radio career as a writer, I think, can be defined by trying to sound more like I sound now just talking to you. Because I'm obviously not reading from a script now. And to prove that point, I'll tell you another anecdote about what it's like when I actually talk in front of an audience versus those of you who've heard me on the radio through earbuds or something. So I was up at NIH giving a talk. I can't even remember about what, but it was related to news coverage. And I had brought with me a news spot that I had written about something or other. Now, news spots are one of the, I write a variety of lengths of stories. There's this funny question when your editor says, "How much time do you need?" And I think, well, I can do it in 30 seconds, I can do it in 2 minutes, or if you want the 6-month version, I can go off and get a degree. It's always a dumb question to me. I can do any story in any length of time that it's allotted, but the newscast, which comes on at the top and the bottom of the hour, has much stricter rules. You really have to come in at under 40 seconds for the part of the presentation that you write. So the format is, the host says, scientists today, they reported, they found a new ring around the planet Neptune, right? NPR's Joe Palca has more. Okay, the rest of the next bit of that is 40 seconds of me saying something. And so those are also written. And usually they don't have any interview tape in them, because 40 seconds doesn't give you a lot of time for interview tape. But I did one on Monday where I did have a 6-second clip of tape from a scientist. So it works sometimes, sometimes it doesn't. But anyway, I read, as part of my presentation, I read this news spot I had written. And afterwards, this woman came up to me and she said, "Hi, I came in a little late, and I wasn't really sure what the program was because I missed your introduction, and your voice sounded familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. And then you read your news spot, and she said, and I knew it was Joe Palca from NPR." And the point is, I do read my stories, and I do sound like I'm reading, and there are some, and that's considered well, it's not a major flaw, but it's not what we're aiming for. And so it's been a struggle, and we get into this NPR sing-song, and I'll play you a piece from NPR, and you'll hear me sound more like the NPR Joe Palca that maybe you've heard before. But it's an interesting problem about how to write. Now, I'll share the flip side of that, which is, you guys have heard of Scott Simon? So Scott Simon sounds really natural on the radio. I mean, he really sounds like Scott Simon. And the thing is, he sounds just like Scott Simon, whether he's on the radio or talking to you at lunch. It sounds natural on the radio, but when I'm just talking to Scott Simon, it sounds weird. Because it's the same voice. And so I think it doesn't, I don't mind being someone slightly different. The Joe Palca that you hear on the radio never gets depressed, never yells at his wife, never has to go to the bathroom all of a sudden. I mean, I'm always there, and I'm ready, and I'm prepared. So it's an interesting problem to know about communicating science. Those are some of the sort of the meta issues related to what I do. Let me go back a little bit and talk to you about my relationship with writing, because I think if you had told me in college or even in graduate school that someday I would make a living writing, I would have laughed at you and thought, that you'd been smoking something, because I detested writing. I hated it. Now, the interesting thing is I say that, and that's my memory, and I even made career choices based on not having to write a lot. But I go back and I read some of the things that I wrote as a person who detested writing, and they're kind of entertaining. I wound up becoming the sports editor of the student newspaper at Pomona College in Claremont, California. And I wrote a pretty entertaining article about taking two of my friends from LA to see a hockey game, and they had never seen ice hockey before. And I explained to them in the article, I was saying, what you do is you turn to the person, after a goal is scored, you turn to the person sitting next to you and describe to him what you both just saw as part of the process of enjoying the game. That was a pretty nice turn of phrase, I kind of like that, but that was fun writing. I think that a lot of college writing is kind of dull, drab, and awful because it's not fun. There's no intention for it to be fun. It's not supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be you write something, and you have a paper to write, and you use wide margins and double spacing so you can get the requisite number of pages to hand in, and then you're done. That kind of writing never appealed to me. But you have to do some, and obviously I did enough. And then I got into graduate school, and I got interested in, I don't know, you didn't hear about this in my background, but I have a PhD in psychology from the University of California, Santa Cruz, where I studied human sleep physiology. And I can tell you the story about why I got interested in human sleep physiology in the question and answer section, if anybody's interested at that point. But I was doing fine as a graduate student, but I wasn't really sure what I was going to do after I graduated. And at the end of, or toward the end of my fourth year in graduate school, I was reading my copy of Science magazine, and I saw an article about a program that was run by the American Association for the Advancement of Science called the Mass Media Science and Engineering Fellows Program. And basically what they did was they took people who were in graduate school and they said, come with us. And for 10 weeks during the summer, they plop you down into a news organization. And I thought, oh, that sounds like fun. So I applied, and I was lucky to get accepted. And I got plopped down into, I was in California, wanted to stay in California, didn't want to go to Washington, not at all. But I got plopped down in they tell you, here's where you're going. They don't actually ask you. And so I got put in the CBS affiliate in Washington, D.C., following around a really great science writer by the name of Steve Gendel. And I spent the summer sort of traipsing around after him. I couldn't do a lot more than watch because it was a union shop, and by union rules I wasn't allowed to write for broadcast, and I wasn't allowed to appear in a broadcast, and I wasn't allowed to interview for broadcast. And also by union rules I wasn't allowed to touch the recording equipment because that was a different union. So it was a little limited in what I could do, but I did research and I watched and I thought, this is fantastic. I want to do this. And I went back to graduate school and finished writing my thesis. And I thought that was going to be a fairly brief operation until I went back to start writing it. And my advisor, who was a really nice guy, but in my opinion a terrible writer, decided that it was his job to improve my writing. So instead of worrying about the content of my thesis, he had to give me all sorts of advice about how to stylistically. And it was very painful, but I made it. I got through it, and I had my PhD, and I left. I never looked back. I just turned. But I thought to myself, okay, how am I going to break into science journalism? That's tricky because there's just, I mean, you know, unlike today where there are tons of jobs, ha ha ha. Back then there were very few jobs, ha ha ha. I mean, that's the you know, oh, it was always better before. No, it's terrible. There was no way, certainly no way to break into television journalism science. And that's what I wanted to do because it had the least amount of writing. I mean, you show a picture. You don't have to describe anything. You just put the picture up and you say, look at the grandeur, you know, or something, and you're done. So that was my plan. And I guess in a way, I want you, in terms of writing and opportunities and pitfalls, whenever you listen to a lecture like what I'm giving you now, talking about the process of writing, pay close attention to what the speaker or writer is doing in terms of whether or not you think it's a good talk or not. Because I haven't said anything about writing yet, but it's all kind of related to writing. I'm telling stories and anecdotes and things like that. And I think that's really important to engaging an audience and becoming a good writer. And a lot of people are bogged down in the specifics. You know, I could tell you about how I structure sentences and stuff like that, but the specifics are much less interesting than the bigger story, I think, I hope. It's got me a career anyway. And so I pay attention to what other people do, and I steal the stuff I like. And I encourage you to do the same. So basically, that's how I learned to be a television, I guess I first was a producer, but I was a writer-producer. The entry-level job in San Francisco at the time was vacation relief writer. And I didn't ever write anything for anybody while I was in this internship because, as I said, I wasn't allowed to. So what I did was I sat down and I tape recorded the 5 o'clock news on every station in San Francisco. And then I transcribed it and I studied the structure. And then I would challenge myself by taking a San Francisco Chronicle article and rewriting it in the style of the local news organization, such I thought. And I got a news director who knew somebody who said he would look at my stuff, and he looked at it. He didn't really have much to say, and I wasn't getting anywhere, but I was learning how to write for television without anybody telling me how to do it, except mimicking the format. And so, that was my theory. I figured I had to get some chops in television before I could even switch to saying, and I want to be a science writer in television. So my plan was get your foot in the door and then start looking for a science job. So one day I went to this event in San Francisco, and it was full of media people, and I met a producer for the KGO, the ABC 7 affiliate in San Francisco, and I said, I'm trying to get a vacation relief writer job. And she said, well, did you take the writing test yet? And I said, they won't give it to me. I don't have enough experience. And she said, oh, they'll give that test to anybody. Call them on Tuesday. Tell them I said so. So I called, and they said, can you come in Thursday and take the writing test? So the writing test was basically what I had been doing. They take this piece of wire copy. Does anybody remember wire copy? It's how we used to get news from the Associated Press and UPI and Reuters. They'd take that off the machine and they'd hand it to you and they'd say, write this as a reader for the hosts. So you do 3 or 4 of those and they say, okay, thank you very much, and you're gone. The next day, Friday, I get a call from one of the producers at the station. Can you come in and work on Monday? Right? I said, sure. So on Monday I show up, and I'm aware of how impossibly ridiculous this is because I've never written anything for anybody ever, and now I'm writing the 5 o'clock news for the #1 station in the 5th largest market in the country. And there's a moment in your life, I hope you all get to experience, where you think, all right, I really shouldn't be doing this, but here I am, and I'm just going to do it. And that's what I did. And I did that for a week, and they said, hey, you should come back next week. I said, great. And so I had a second week. And in the course of the second week, somebody called me up from Washington and told me that there was a job that I could take on a temporary, no, it was a full-time job at the NBC Washington Bureau, putting mail in mailboxes. I was a desk assistant. And so I took that job, and they said at KGO, hey, you want to come back next week? And I said, no, I've got a job in Washington, D.C. And that was a turning point. That's one of the things, that's, one of the roads not taken kind of thing. I don't know what would have happened to my career if I hadn't have gone to Washington, but I decided to go to Washington, and a lot of things fell into place. I realized I haven't said anything, so I better speed up. Point is, I wound up as the health and science producer for the same station 3 years later. Very lucky, loved it. And then one day the phone rang, and it was the editor of Nature offering me a job in the Washington Bureau of Nature magazine. Now, I'm not going to tell you that story because it's too long and I have other things to tell you, but that's crazy. How could that have ever happened? And suddenly I have to go to work and write for a living. Write all the time, write a lot. But I figured I could do it, and I did it. And a friend of mine very helpfully said, oh, you're going to have to write on deadline, too. And I thought, thank you. Yes, I know that. But I took the job, and it seemed to work out. And then, like I say, I was traded to science for a future draft pick. And I would have stayed at science. I liked writing at that point. I liked being the #1 writer for science, which I was, I guess, by some measures. But I didn't like my editor. And so my friend at NPR said, hey, we're looking for a 1-year sabbatical replacement for a guy who's going someplace. And I said, okay, I'll do that. So I took a pay cut and a temporary job at NPR. Now, that's almost 26 years ago. So that's where I got to. And the reason I bring it up, and I guess it relates to is I started as a scientist not liking to write at all. Then I went into television, where the audience is supposed to be the 8-year-old audience or the 12-year-old audience that you're writing for. And then I went to Nature, where they're at least 14 or 15. Now, they're much more serious, and the writing style was, everything I could think of to be interesting. And then I went to NPR, and I went back to a general audience. And I like writing for a general audience because they are the ones that need to know about science, and that's where you get opportunities and pitfalls. I think, as I said, that I think that there's a lot of problems. There's a lot of people now who want to do a better job of communicating science, and they're very earnest about it and very passionate about it. The problem that they have, that I had when I first started getting out, is they know too much. And they're trying to cram everything into a 3-minute piece, and you cannot. And you think, well, I really should explain, the pH is really a factor here. Who cares? Right? This is not a class that you're taking a test for, where somebody's going to ask you, oh, I have a joke. Here's my science joke. I get to tell this. What do you call 6 times 10 to the 23 avocados? A guacamole. I like that one. Anyway, can't tell that joke to a general audience. I was counting on you. Here's one you can tell. Did you hear about the restaurant that just opened on the moon? Great food, but no atmosphere? Tell that one. You have to make certain assumptions about what your audience does and doesn't know. But again, my point in telling you all this is that you have to keep it simple. And you have to get away from trying to put in all the facts and all the knowledge. And a lot of times, and I find this over and over and over again, you go in, you do an interview, you learn all sorts of really interesting things, and then you ask yourself, what's the key point of this story? And you realize that all the interesting things that you learned in the interview are going to go out the window, because the key thing is, like the story I mentioned about earlier this week, artificial skin. So these people in Stanford are building this polymer. It's actually multiple layers of a polymer that's stretchable so it can bend like skin. It's waterproof, so it can not get ruined if it gets wet. It's self-repairing because of the way the bonds form. If you tear it, it'll actually re-anneal if you just leave it quietly for a little bit. And it's electronic, so they built in various pressure sensors, and now in this little piece of plastic the size of your thumb, they've packed in 108 transistors, which means they can build a simple amplifier or analog to digital, the start of an analog to digital signal processor. So it's really cool. Well, I knew a lot of stuff about this transistors and how many layers it was and how many this and how many that and how many, and then I realized, no, none of that's going to go in because it's too complicated. All I can say is they made another step in building skin. Oh, what do you need for skin? Well, you need to have waterproof and flexible, and now they have this way of getting electrical signals, like from touching something like your nerve would to your brain. Now they've got an electrical signal that goes from the nerve to an amplifier that can then go into a computer, and the computer can make sense of it. That's it, right? And then I had the piece of tape I wanted to use was cool, and so I said, does it need a power supply? And she said, yes, it does, but we're trying to build a stretchable battery too. Oh, okay, there's the ender, right? What comes next? Building a battery onto this piece of skin so you don't have to attach an external power supply. Whole little story. The news part of it was one sentence, or part of one sentence. But the story was, here's somebody trying to build this, and they've accomplished this, and now they've got this new bit, and soon they have to have another bit, and they're working on it. That kind of storytelling is universal, and so I'm going to show you a little bit. So, pitfalls. Well, you can get it wrong. That's the pitfall. The opportunity is you can get people interested in something that they might never have thought about, which is the opportunity. So this is my feeling about storytelling basics. Almost every story that I have to tell can be started with a once upon a time. So once upon a time, some scientists wanted to build some artificial skin for people who have a prosthetic limb or were burned or something. So they had various materials in the lab, or there was a young princess who grew up in the castle, and there was a dragon. In this case, it would be the NIH who was going to withhold funds unless they figured out how to make this artificial skin work. And they had other problems. They had to convince the faculty senate to let them keep their work going. And they had to decide, well, one day the princess gets stolen by the dragon, and the elders get together and decide what to do. And they decide, well, the best thing is to get a knight to go slay the dragon. So in this case, they do work in the lab, and they get a smart postdoc, and they figure out the problem, and it all ends happily ever after. The knight gets the queen, and the bitcoins come in. It's just astounding how many stories can use that structure if you think about it. Okay, so now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of the talk. The other part was just filler. This is really where it gets exciting. And by the way, I'm going to talk for probably another 10 minutes or so, and then I hope you guys will engage in question and answer with me, because then you can ask me the thing that I haven't told you that you really want to know, that I didn't know you wanted to know until you asked me. Clear? Okay. So, as you've heard, I've been working in radio the last 26 years. I still write other things from time to time, including a book, which was a lot of radio stories strung together. But one thing that's very different about radio, at least as I've been able to figure out, is you only get to say one thing in a story. You really can't, I mean, you know, if you listen carefully, and I know some of you love NPR, some of you hate NPR, whatever, but NPR is reckoned to be the in-depth radio. We're really giving you all the in-depth knowledge. If you listen to it, at least in science, I mean, because of the nature of science, because I can't assume that you know anything. I mean, it's a little bit like hearing about curling on the radio. Most of the time in sports, they don't tell you. If you don't know what an ERA is, they don't tell you. If you don't know what a batting average is, tough. They're not going to explain it. But I have to explain everything. And now they have to explain everything in curling because that doesn't make any sense to anybody. So if I'm doing a story about artificial skin, I have to explain, a lot of stuff about what skin is and what it does before I can even tell them what's new. So if you listen to science stories, you're basically limited to one thought, one idea that you're trying to get across. And that's another problem that especially scientists trying to talk to the public, they're trying to tell too much. And they're really, but even so, it's like giving an entire year of biophysics in a 3.5-minute box. It doesn't work. You can pick one thing that's interesting, or maybe two, maybe. But the format I work in, it's got to be short. So that's one rule. The other rule, and I'm very proud of myself because I figured out how to do this using PowerPoint. I don't use PowerPoint very much. But I think of radio stories as like an arrow, because once you start, there's no turning back. You cannot say, now, as you remember 2 minutes ago when I was telling you about the blah, blah, blah. You can't do that. You can when you're Joe Palca, but as a general rule, don't do it. Because you really have to keep a very linear process, especially in radio, because there's no, if somebody you have to keep going forward. And I guess that flows into the next question. This is what we call on the radio a signpost. If you lose people, if you say something critically important in minute 1, and you come back to it in minute 3, chances are people won't remember what you said. So you have to think of tricky, clever ways to remind people what the story's about. Now, you remember the story we're trying to find a nerve cell in the brain that responds to light. Well, when you do... Okay, so I've just brought us back into the moment after having done something else. We call this signposting, and if you listen for it, you'll hear the better radio stories will sort of say, their quest for artificial skin was thwarted by something. And I'm just reminding you, this is a story about artificial skin. And so these signposts are really critical. I think they're useful, and I think this whole straightforward writing style is useful for any kind of writing. Because if you can go declarative sentence, declarative, declarative, declarative sentence, the end, you're probably writing something people will understand, right? Because if you have to do lots of dependent clauses and following back, and remember I said you're not organized carefully. Okay, and then can I make a holy pact with you guys? I don't want anybody to leave. If you can't do this, you're welcome to leave now. But I don't want anyone to ever write this phrase. It is the most banal, obvious thing you can possibly write. Not everyone agrees. You hear it every day on NPR, every single day. Not everyone agrees. Really? Damn, I was sure everybody was on the same page on this one. Not everyone agrees? Come on, we could do better than that. And that's where I come to cliches. I mean, there's times when you're stuck with a few ways of describing something, but for the most part, be creative, come up with interesting sentences. Instead of not everyone agrees, why don't you say something positive like, so-and-so thinks that's a really bad idea and here's why. Or whatever. But don't, what a, not everyone agrees. Love. And there's all sorts of variations of it, but you'll be listening for it now and you'll say, oh, I'm never going to do that. Okay, the other thing is, if you can't be interesting, be brief. That's one of my mantras. I figure if I don't have 4 minutes worth of material that's interesting, maybe I can get away with 2 minutes worth of material that's interesting, and it'll be over and we can all go to the bar. Okay, so what I'm going to do is subject you to an example of a story that I think I like to play for people because it represents the ability to say something complicated in a straightforward, simple way and get it right and be entertaining and keep it short. And so you could decide if I've accomplished all those things, but this is a story I did a few years ago. I don't have to tell you what it's about because you'll hear what it's about. It's short.
We're going to take a break from today's big story to bring you this item, which is about time. You'll have more time to celebrate New Year's Eve this year, but not much. The international body that's charged with keeping time on track has decreed that there will be a leap second added to the end of 2005. NPR's Joe Palca explains why.
The reason is there's time, and then there's time. Once upon a time, a second was defined as 1/86,400th of the time it took the Earth to make one revolution on its axis with respect to the Sun. Astronomers liked that definition because it meant the Sun was directly overhead at the same time every day, high noon. But some timekeepers don't care about things like stars and the rotation of the Earth. For them, time is, and always should be, a constant. The Earth's rotation is wobbling all over the place. Why, the rotation is affected by things like melting glaciers, El Nino, even the tides, they cried. So the constant time crowd likes what the 13th General Conference on Weights and Measures came up with for a reference in 1967. Namely, that a second is the duration of 9,192,631,770 periods of the radiation corresponding to the transition between the two hyperfine levels of the ground state of the cesium-133 atom. Now there's a number you can hang your hat on. But this left everyone with a problem. The time based on hyperfine levels of cesium and the time based on Earth's rotation have a habit of slipping out of sync. Earth is rotating just the tiniest bit slower than it used to. So every few years, the International Earth Rotation and Reference System Service, aka la Service International de la Rotation de la Terre et des Systèmes de Référence, decrees that there will be a leap second to make up the difference. The last one was at the end of 1998, and the next one is at the end of this year. Enjoy it. Joe Palca, NPR News, Washington. There's a couple things I want to call your attention to. First of all, I violated my own rules by I would tell you not to throw in lots and lots of numbers like that, but I was trying to make a point of being as complex and obscure, and like the hyperfine cesium levels it's ridiculous. No, but it was a great number. I like that very much. And then if you notice, how much of that is just me being silly as opposed to me explaining anything. I feel that, again, for what I do, and I don't know, maybe it's not relevant especially to what you do, but for me, I have to get people's attention because I'm one click of the dial or one click of the mouse away from being put into oblivion. And so I have to do something that's going to keep people's attention. And part of that I think of as putting on the big red clown nose and the floppy shoes and the funny makeup and coming out and looking fun. I figure that's part of my shtick, is to get people to pay attention. Sometimes I do it in a more serious way, but there's a necessity of getting people to listen, because if I did a great story but nobody heard it, it doesn't count. This is the other thing I wanted to play for you because this is very nice.
Joe Palca's story about the leap second that's coming at the end of the year brought this comment.
I'm writing to congratulate you on a very clear presentation of the principles of atomic time and the need for leap seconds. This is a difficult topic, and your report handled it very well.
That's from Judah Levine. He's with the Time and Frequency Division of the National Institute of Standards and Technology in Boulder, Colorado.
I love playing that. Anyway, I think I'll stop there and see if there are any questions. Thank you for your attention. What's Nina Totenberg really like? Yes, go ahead.
What sorts of things did you undertake as you were going through your schooling that prepared you for your mass media fellowship?
Nothing, honestly. I think, no, really, nothing. I wrote an essay about myself, and my wife looked at it and said, "This is terrible." She said, "You're a much more interesting person than you wrote about. Write about yourself in a way that really shares with people, who you are and what you do and what you want to try." If I said to you, I can tell you, you asked my preparation, I can tell you now that I've been a judge for that very same competition. It's so competitive now that people who are judging it tend to look for people who, at least I am looking for people who are making a sort of a commitment. Like a lot of people who write it and they say, "I've always wanted to be a writer," and I kind of look to see what they've written, and they say, "Well, I haven't written anything yet, but it's something I really want to do," and I go, "Goodbye," because I think, as I said, when I decided I was going to do writing, I did it, and I think that's it's a participation sport. You don't think about it. You have to do it, and then you have to do it and do it and do it and do it and do it. So people who are like, there's some people, I would also be, the program was not intended to be a minor league for wannabe science writers. It's kind of turned into that, but never mind. The program, if somebody wrote to me and said, "I have absolutely no interest in going into science writing, but I really am interested in why the media behaves the way they do and how they cover things the way they do, and I really would like to understand that so I can go back to my university job and help my colleagues understand how to deal with the media," I'd give that person a fellowship in a heartbeat, because that's another really valuable lesson for being a AAAS media fellow. But in terms of, if you're saying my reason for doing this, I wanted to do, I wrote the essay that said it's important for the public to understand science, and I like teaching. I guess I would say that was one thing that helped prepare. I like the teaching and the interaction, and so, the fact I taught statistics for psych majors to the graduating seniors who had to pass or they wouldn't graduate. And if you want a hostile audience that's hard to keep attention, they had to pass the class, so it's a little bit cheating. But I walked into that class with an attitude, which I think is very important to bring to everything you write, which is, you don't realize this right now because you have to take this class, but this is the most interesting class you're going to take in your college career. You're going to learn about patterns and numbers, and it's just fascinating. And I will try to share with you some of that delight and joy that I take in teaching you about this. Whoa, nobody else on the faculty would go near the class, but I was interested in the money and I was a graduate student. But I do think that attitude is important to bring. A lot of people get stuck with writing something. Certainly I've written stories that I didn't want to write. But you get to a point when you realize, hey, well, this is kind of interesting, and you dig in there, and you try your best to make it as engaging as you possibly can. So that, and the other thing, again, in terms of practical, if I get a letter from me, somebody like me, who says, this person's worked with me, and I can tell they're passionate about communicating science, and I'm looking for that more than the PI who says, so-and-so completed all classes successfully and showed great determination when pursuing scientific problems in the lab, and I'd be glad to have him or her on my team. No, yeah, that's the science-y part of it. I want to hear the communication part of it from people. So that's the most practical advice I can give you about that. Yeah?
So when you're interviewing scientists, this list does not need to be exhaustive, but what are one of those two things where you think, aha, this person hit it on the nail, and one or two things when you think to yourself, I can't believe this is happening, this is a disaster? What are some of those key things?
Well, the key things are when the scientists, and usually it's scientists who've been interviewed before, but they've found a metaphor that really helps capture what they're doing. And for me, I mean, there's a lot of scientists who have media training, and that usually is bad for me because I'm trying to talk to the scientist as a person, and I'm not really too worried about how they talk as long as they talk to me as a person. And if they start using jargon, I might stop them, but mostly I just want them to talk. And a lot of times when you've been trained by a media trainer, you're trained to stay on message. And so you're supposed to say, well, Mars is very important. And I don't know, okay, so what are you going to do, with this probe that you're doing? Well, Mars is very important. And you think, wait a minute, you just said that. So I think there's a problem. But yeah, the people who are good with metaphor, and obviously the people who do try to put in too much detail, and especially ones who use, I mean, again, my attitude is, Susan Stamberg said this to me a long time ago, and I kind of take it as gospel. I'm the communicator. If the scientists aren't good at communicating, I'll do the heavy lifting. You just tell me what your favorite color is, right? Or some question like that. Because my other goal is to make you into a human being as opposed to an expert. I like talking to experts, but I don't like talking to people who stop being people and have become experts. So for me, the disaster is, and the other disaster is when people know what I should do. That's very disconcerting. I know what your story is. Oh, okay. But yeah, metaphor, people who are comfortable, and people who like to tell anecdotes. I mean, a lot of times, one attitude I get from scientists a lot, and I'm sympathetic to this up to a point, is scientists will say, oh, it's not about me, it's about my science. And I get that when you're talking to a scientific audience, although even then it's about you. But in my context, it's totally about you. We're both talking. We're both going to go on the radio. Somebody's going to hear what you say. If you say it in a boring monotone, I can write those words down, and they will sound the same in print. But on the radio, if you say it in a boring monotone, it'll be terrible. So I'm looking for people who bring energy too. But not everybody's comfortable with that. I get that. And I've often, people ask, well, how do you decide who to interview? Well, I try to interview energetic, intelligent, intellectual people. And when I get done with all the energetic, intelligent, and articulate ones, then I'll go into the less energetic but intelligent and articulate. And then I'll go to the not energetic at all and intelligent and not articulate. But I figure I've got a lot to work through before I get to the not energetic, not articulate, intelligent people. Because honestly, they're not going to get on the radio as often. Yes, sir.
What is your opinion and advice on the use of analogies to convey scientific concepts?
What's the alternative?
Well, I don't really think that analogies, I mean, if you choose them right, they're okay.
Right.
But for example, a lot of times they're not, because then it gets your audience thinking about whatever the concept about your analogy is. And one of the things that brought this back to my mind this week was the articles that are written on Gunther Global's death, who just died last Friday.
Oh.
They use the analogy of the sequences that are in proteins that target at different locations in the cell. They use the analogy of zip codes.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm thinking of the incompetent postman who's delivering packages to different people's mailboxes incorrectly, things like that. So I'm thinking about the mail service, not what's going on.
Yeah. Where did you hear that? Was that in the New York Times or?
I think it was.
Yeah. Well, okay. When I said what's the alternative, I mean, nobody's actually, I mean, now people have seen proteins in cell, but Gunther Blobel, when he came up with this, had never actually seen a protein. He was coming up with an analogy for what was going on inside the cells, or a description that fit the facts, right? When we take it one step further to make an analogy that more people are familiar with, yes, the opportunity for sending people down the wrong path goes up. But the problem is, absent a PhD in molecular and cell biology, what are you going to do? You have to, you take the metaphors that are at your disposal or the analogies, and you use them as best you can, because the most accurate ones are probably too obscure for the public. So I don't see, I can understand why you think, oh, well, zip code, you can pick the wrong analogy, and I guess what I would say is help writers or help on your own stuff work hard to come up with the best analogy and the one that works the best, because there's really, there's really just, apart from saying, well, I can't really explain this to you, you're going to have a degree in biology first. That's not the way journalism is done. But I'm aware, as someone who comes out of it, it's what bothers me, for example, you guys know Radiolab? So I love Radiolab. I think they do a fantastic job. But one thing they do that I don't like is when they do a story, they talk to science journalists instead of scientists. The reason they do that is that science journalists are frequently more articulate. But a lot of the time, and you know this and I know this, I can do a story about some topic in science, and I could spend a lot of time getting to know it. But even in a month or 2 months, or even writing a book about something, I'm probably not going to be as expert in that topic as the person who did the PhD in it. And so my ability to come up with the accurate analogy is going to be less good, worse, than the scientist. So I worry that if I vet one analogy with the scientist, and the scientist says, yeah, that's great, and then I go to the Radiolab people, and they say, I don't really like that analogy, can you give me another one? And I got to come up with one on the spot. I'm into swirling waters at that point. So to me, it's always a negotiation between me and the scientist to come up with, I do this a lot. So what you're saying is, or can I say it's like, or something, and that's the negotiation. If I try and get it right, I've been lucky. I can show you lots of letters. Maybe the people who think I completely screwed it up just don't write me, but usually they do. So I've done it well enough, but I don't think there's any alternative. That's my answer. Yes, ma'am.
So do you think having a PhD kind of, I know you said you can be more of an expert and create better analogies, but do you think that causes you to have over detailed research?
Oh yes, and I don't get me wrong. My only expertise is 35 years old in a very narrow portion of sleep research, and I can tell you I haven't been called on very often to make analogies about it. So it's a tiny, it had nothing to do with artificial skin or laser communication in space or anything like that. So I don't think that having a PhD has been helpful at all in terms of coming up with analogies for stories. It helps a little bit in understanding the scientific method. And the other thing that it does, and this is, I think personally it's a drawback, is I think like a scientist more of the time than like a journalist. And a lot of the times I think, oh, that's hardly surprising. And then I read something, shocking news today that something that, doesn't work. And I'm going, well, it was experimental. Of course it didn't. It's a chance it didn't work. That's the whole thing about, I hear these stories. It was even this morning on NPR. I'm desperate to try this experimental drug. Do you know what it means to try an experimental drug? It means it might kill you faster, or it might make you better, but it's an experiment. So being desperate to try it means, well, you don't have any alternative. I get that. But it doesn't mean you're denying me access to experimental drugs is somehow bad for me. You can think of it as being good for you because it's not going to kill you faster. But that's the journalist does the thing. These patients are desperate and they'll do anything to get their experimental drug. And I'm going, think about it, what's really going on, It's experimental. You have to be brave to take an experimental drug. I know you're going to die in an hour and a half, and maybe you're only going to die in an hour, or 2 hours or something. I'm sorry, I get a little pissy about that. But I just don't think people really understand, access to experimental therapies isn't like, oh, we're being mean to you for not letting you have it. It's a decision that we get to make. And you could say, all right, autonomy, everybody gets to try everything. But sometimes I think responsible scientists would say, Laetrile. You probably guys mostly don't remember Laetrile. A lot of people said, you've got to give us Laetrile. Why? Why? Remember, there's another one. You remember when breast cancer was being treated by stem cell therapy, stem cell transplants, mandated by the U.S. Congress that the U.S. pay for that, insurance companies pay. It doesn't work. The studies that it were based on were partially fraudulent. But people had to have that experimental therapy. I don't know. Sorry. I got on my soapbox. Yes, ma'am.
I have to follow up to that. So
Yes.
I guess, as someone who you interview, I assume people who are in science communications, or you can theoretically imagine interviewing someone, right? So would you be more likely to take somebody who had a PhD rather than not, or consider interviewing them? Or are you just caring about the three things, like the intellectual, articulate, and energetic?
Oh, well, in my world, when I interview people, I want to interview the people who are doing the work. I don't want to interview people who are talking about the work that they've read about or learned about.
In theory, if you were, if someone was, looking for a job in science.
Oh, no, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
It does not matter. I just hired, if you want to see what the next generation of science journalism at NPR looks like, pay attention to the woman I just hired, Maddie Sophia. She's doing these short video pieces called Maddie About Science. She just finished her PhD in immunology and bacteriology. And I'm beating the scientist out of her. It's taking some time. But she's a natural, and she's very smart, and she understands the science really well. But she just talks to people, and she's curious and funny, and it all comes across very well in the way she does it. There's one she just did that went up yesterday with Adam Cole about how long you're infectious after you've gotten the flu, and it's great. This is great. It's entertaining and it's accurate. I think and that's why I love Maddie, because she was terrified that she was getting some factoid wrong about how long you're infectious for, or how big the droplet size are. Any little detail that she put in, she's very eager to get it right. So I wouldn't necessarily have picked her. I didn't pick her because she had a PhD, but she was really passionate about doing science communication, and she wore me down. Yes, sir.
So I know you said that the sports guys don't have to explain DRA and all that, but there must be a baseline. There must be something that you say, well, I don't have to say the earth is round, or, DNA is such and such. So how do you determine what the baseline is? Is there a guideline, or how do you know?
That's the genius. No, it's true. So when did we stop saying DNA, the building blocks of life, or the blueprint of life, I've been coming to think recently that it would be more important for me to be edited by the arts desk than it is by the science desk, because I think the science desk has already, we've taken on board a certain level of understanding, and I would really like somebody who is certifiably not interested in science to listen to the piece and see if they understand it. So the answer is, it's a judgment call, and there is no guidebook. And it's amazing, really. But it is something. It's a negotiation with your editor. Every time you want to say something, you have to say, "Can I say this, or do I have to explain it?" And as I say, we've become. I work with the same editor year after year, and we think, "Oh, okay, you explained that 2 years ago. We don't have to do that again." Well, of course you have to do it again, but we forget. We're human. So I think when people dishabituate, it's useful. But there's no book. I just figure. I figure if I tell my kid, well, they're all too old now, but when they were like 12 or 13, if they knew what I was talking about, I just went with it. And if they didn't, I'd try to realize I was making assumptions that I shouldn't make. Yeah.
For someone who is a scientist and happy to, keep this job and keep doing this, but interested in trying to be better at
Yep.
like your practices that.
Yep.
What are ways to start? Just to sort of get more practice.
Well, actually, Maddie will kill me if I don't tell you about this. So one of the things we're doing at NPR now, I've been encouraged to do, is we've been recruiting people that we call, so this project I've been working on is called Joe's Big Idea, and I'm not going to tell you why it's called that. But we've created this thing called Friends of Joe's Big Idea, FOJOBIs. You guys like acronyms? I love acronyms. So FOJOBI are Friends of Joe's Big Idea. And what the idea was is we were trying to get people who sort of, we kind of want to get better at communicating, and we want to know places to start. And so that's what if you go to the Joe's Big Idea webpage on NPR or the Friends of Joe's Big Idea webpage, please join. You're all welcome. There's no bar to entry. It's just a way to meet people who are thinking the way you are. I'd like to get a little better at this. We now have 700 around the country. But the answer is just do it. I mean, I know it sounds like silly, but there's a bunch of blogs out now. Massive is one. There's a blog at Yale. There's a blog at Carnegie Mellon. There's just a lot of blogs where people write about things that they're interested in. And we just, this woman wrote this incredibly great story about how hard it was to explain to her grandmother, who didn't speak English as a first language, spoke Spanish, what her work was about and how she had to learn how to frame it in a way. And that got picked up by Nature Jobs, and it's on the Nature Jobs blog. And I'm so proud. She'd never written anything for publication anywhere ever before. And I'm just going, hey, there's, especially for scientists now, there's something called The Conversation. Have you heard about that? So it's a magazine that's started in Australia where they say scientific rigor and journalistic flair, what we were talking about. So they try to get scientists to work with editors to make sure they get the analogies right and spin them into stories. So in terms of online, there's lots of opportunities, but I would say it's easy to practice at a dinner party, at a sport, sitting in the stands of a sporting event, or someplace where you're allowed to talk and you don't have to, you're not going to annoy people, but just get into the habit of telling people what you do and watch when their eyes glaze over and they don't understand, and then try to back off and explain it a little better. Don't be so broad. People are interested in things, but and again, I think you've listened patiently to me talking for an hour now, but part of the thing is tell people stories, give them anecdotes, tell them about how, something weird that happened in the lab today and it reminded you of and then, use it as a conversation starter and get people engaged that way. But the answer is, this is why, I didn't do it in graduate school, so I'm not telling you should let's do as I say, not as I do. I am saying that, but if you want to do it, just do it. It's amazing that in my backpack, I can carry absolutely everything I need to do an international radio broadcast. And I don't even need a backpack this big. That your laptop has all the tools you need to create a radio program. If that's your thing, I can, join FOJOBIs and we'll tell you where you can do podcasts. If it's writing is your thing, we have a guy who does graphic arts, and he just wants to get better at it, and so good for him. Let's do it. It's fun. Yes. I go off duty in a little bit, Go ahead.
Do you have any advice for talking to what I would call the anti-NPR listeners?
Oh.
Who have somehow, because not all scientists agree, sometimes we get things wrong, therefore we're not like cohesive authority.
Yeah.
Like mean,
Right.
how can
Well, obviously, I don't succeed, or they would be NPR listeners. but the answer to I think the key question for our time, I'm inclined to believe that most NPR listeners are thoughtful, science-fearing, believing, whatever, citizens. But the answer to the question is to start relating to people on a personal level. I think what happens is that, first of all, nobody likes to feel they're stupid, or nobody likes to feel he or she is stupid, if you prefer. So that's the bad way of saying, if you just listen and I'm going to speak clearly, you will understand. That doesn't work. So what I think has to happen is you have to find points of intersection where you do agree. And when people say, I don't trust scientists. Well, how do you feel about gravity? Does that one bother you too? That satellite that's sending you those television pictures of Fox News, that was science. Somebody did that. So I'm being silly for the purposes of making that, because we confront that's what a lot of the scientists, they think. They go home, they tell me they go home and they tell their parents, or their uncles and aunts who voted for Trump or believe in something, that's anti-science. And they say, what do I do? And I said, you relate to them because you're a person and they like you. You're their cousin, their nephew, their aunt, their uncle. And you can only just start small. So I believe that's my other, I'm sort of my 1,000 points of light idea is that if we get a lot of people in the scientific world committed to talking not down to people but with people about science, that will help raise the dialogue all around. That's me being Pollyanna-ish. But that's partly why why am I here? I'm here because I believe that message is something I want to tell people about, and I want to get them engaged and excited if I can. Yes, ma'am.
So I think these conversations always make me think of something that was really captured. I don't know if anyone saw the documentary Long Live the Dodo.
Yeah, flock of dodos.
Flock of dodos.
Yeah.
Something about dodos.
Yeah.
And I guess a point that was made was something that I hadn't thought about much before that is that they were kind of comparing the evolution, people who believe evolution versus people who don't, as kind of like the Al Gore versus George W. Bush. Al Gore is smarter, but you want to have a beer with George W. Bush. And then they're saying how the people who were invested in creationism and and intelligent design and pruning, they have a lobby, they have an agenda. And then they kept flashing to this bunch of evolutionary biologists. It was like a bunch of guys sitting around in old T-shirts, eating pizza and drinking beer, who they didn't have any. They liked they're doing their science and they weren't that interested. So I think a lot of it's not just convincing people, it's just realizing that, okay, you have to step up your game because the people who don't have the truth to talk about have.
Right. Well, they're engaged.
Yeah.
They're passionate, and they're not beyond talking to people and trying to convince them and maybe able to disagree. I don't know. But yes, that very point is the one I came with. He said, I met the guy who made that film. He's an interesting guy. And you should have him come and talk. But he basically said, the people you want to have a beer with, in the end, and he was a scientist, and he grew up in Kansas, and he went back home, and he said the anti-evolutionary crowd, the religious crowd, much more cordial people. Scientists were kind of aloof and dismissive. So think about that. Aloof and dismissive does not make a good connection with anybody.